Lecture 3, Moliere, the Misanthrope, Professor Michael Sugrue.
Moliere is one of the greatest figures in French literature, and he was certainly the most gifted, or one of the most gifted, of the French dramatists of the 17th century. He produced more than 30 plays, and although he made contributions to all genres of dramatic literature, including farce and tragicomedy and light opera, his greatest achievements were in the realm of the 5-act philosophical comedy. Don Juan and Tartuffe and The Misanthrope, I think, are among the greatest achievements of French literature, and since French literature is on the whole so outstanding, one of the greatest, among the greatest achievements in the history of world literature. During the 17th century, when Moliere was alive, he wasn't very satisfactory, or the appreciation of him wasn't very satisfactory. Comedy was looked down upon compared to tragedy and more noble or aristocratic forms of drama. Comedy seemed relatively unimportant and relatively plebeian. In 1673, 4 nights after the opening of his final play, The Imaginary Invalid, Moliere died. He had been acting the lead in the play, and while on stage, he felt the first twinges of the heart attack that killed him. He knew that he was terminally ill when he was writing his final play, which is a comedy about someone who's a hypochondriac. So the irony there is actually quite apt. Not only was he a very gifted comedian, he was a philosophical comedian, and he thought about the purposes of comedy, and his comedies were meant to have a didactic purpose. Moliere would have agreed with Plato or with Tolstoy that at least one of the main functions of art is that it should create a moral response in the spectator. In other words, he tried to create moral art. Tartuffe criticizes religious bigotry and hypocrisy. The Miser criticizes avarice. The other plays are meant as well to edify as well as amuse. So this is a kind of moral art. Now, his plays are wonderful. They're written in verse, and he is a supremely gifted verse writer. The plots of the plays, well, sometimes can be rather thin, and particularly the conclusions of the plays sometimes seem rather forced. It seems as though the verse is kind of driving the play. But the plots, while they are thin, always serve a sort of moral function. The characters, like we find in most of comedy, the characters tend to be types rather than people. We see the type of the miser, or in something like Don Juan, the type of the lustful and cruel man, rather than some particular individual. In some respects, it could be compared with the medieval morality plays, something like Every Man, which is a play that's a little bit light on character development, since after all, the key figure is every man. It's not like the Shakespearean tragedies where we see Othello as Othello, not an example of a jealous man. So many of the characters that we see in Moliere's plays are types, are examples of some tendency in the human psyche or in society as a whole. There's a clear didactic intent, and there's some very powerful symbolism in Moliere's plays. And I want to take as my example of Moliere's plays The Misanthrope, which is one of my favorite plays, one of my favorite works of literature anywhere. I would be inclined to say, as a matter of personal judgment, that Moliere's Misanthrope and Shakespeare's Measure for Measure are the two greatest achievements of Western comic literature. I'll try and make good on that claim about Moliere in the following lecture. Moliere held that theater is the school of men, and what he meant by that is that in going to the theater and experiencing moral art, the spectators ought to be morally improved, because a good comedy is one that holds vice up to ridicule, makes it appear ridiculous and thus odious. And by making human vice and sin and depravity odious, we recognize these sins, or these evils, these failures in ourselves as well as in the character, and we are improved thereby. Now, not everybody bought that. Some of the criticism that he received about Tartuffe from religious bigots suggested that they thought that he was having a bad effect. But there's a clear didactic intent. Clearly, Moliere wants to teach as well as amuse and entertain. Now, if we look at something like the case of Moliere's Misanthrope, what we get is a very carefully crafted play which refers not just to certain qualities of the human condition, although it does that, and it refers not just to certain moral problems, it also, in the case of The Misanthrope, refers back to itself. It's a comedy talking about comedy as a whole, and that's one of the most intriguing parts about it. So let's look at the comedy itself. It's done with a small number of main characters. There are 4 main characters and a few characters that are thrown in for purposes of serving the plot. But the 4 main characters are kind of both symbols and vehicles by which he can morally improve us. The first and most important character is the misanthrope himself. His name is Alceste. And Alceste is a good man, but he lacks what Aristotle would have called phronesis. Phronesis in Aristotelian ethics is judgment, or we would translate it as judgment in English. He has no sense of proportion. Although he's a virtuous man, he's on a bit of an ego trip, and he can't help constantly deprecating the evils that he sees in other people and in society. The implication is always that he is virtuous, or at least in a position to judge other people's moral failings. And not only that, but he has no sense of proportion. He is completely tactless. He can't keep his mouth shut. He doesn't know when he ought to condemn failings and when he ought to just go along for the ride and at least be quiet, or at least say something tactful if he can't be candid. So Alceste is the key figure in The Misanthrope. He is the title character. His friend, Philinte, is another kind of moral figure. He has the same moral understanding as the misanthrope. He sees the failings and vices and evils in people, but he has a sense of proportion. He's tactful as well as moral. He's the kind of person who understands the failings that are part of the human condition and the evils that are a necessary part of society, and he knows when he should go along with the flow, when he should be willing to offer praise when he doesn't really mean it, when it's appropriate to engage in a certain degree of hypocrisy. In other words, Philinte is someone that can tell the difference between an outright fabrication and what we might call a white lie. For the misanthrope, for Alceste, there's no such thing as a white lie. There are only lies and truths. And the more pointed and jagged and painful a truth, you get the impression the more he likes those kinds of truth. There's no such thing as a white lie for the misanthrope. Another main character is Eliante, who is the sort of alter ego of Philinte. She is also virtuous and compassionate and understanding, and she admires Alceste. She admires the misanthrope on account of the fact that he appears to be a very conscientious, virtuous man, but she's able to see his flaws and his defects. She sees that although he is virtuous, there are certain problems with a man like this, and there are certain ways in which he's rather inhuman and arrogant in his relationship to the rest of society. The last of the main characters is Célimène, and she's 20 years old and a beautiful young woman who mixes in the best society, and she's a coquette. She's a flirt. She likes to have many suitors knocking on her door. She's on a perpetual ego trip, and she's a vicious gossip, and she's extremely hypocritical, and she's extremely two-faced, and she exemplifies and epitomizes many of the things that the misanthrope hates about society. All of the evils and all of the hypocrisy and posturing that's characteristic of aristocratic French society is found in Célimène. Now, one of the great ironies here is that our very rational, very dispassionate, very moral misanthrope Alceste is also in love with Célimène. Perhaps it's said that opposites attract. Certainly for the ironic purposes of a comedy, it works out very nicely that he should be the slave to his desires in this respect, unable to completely see the flaws in Célimène. He accuses her, but he always accepts her explanations or her lies about her behavior. He is, in fact, not nearly so rational or nearly so moral as he thinks. As we will find out at the end of the play, the misanthrope, Alceste, is a man who does not know himself very well. He thinks that he is the only person who is honest, the only person who really understands the depravity of society. He's a figure like Jeremiah in the Old Testament, constantly thundering about evil and hypocrisy. He's, in some respects, has the same temperament as someone like Jonathan Swift, a man who's completely disgusted with the people around him and the ways of the world. And the difficulty is that it prevents him from really being a social animal. And as Aristotle says to us, man is a social animal. To adopt this misanthropic posture is in some respects not just arrogant, but inhuman. Now, the plot of the play runs something like this. The first scene is with Alceste and Philinte having a discussion. And the extreme views held by the misanthrope come out directly here. He's thundering about hypocrisy, and he's inveighing against the evil that he sees in aristocratic French society. No one is honest. No one is sincere. No one is really candid. The world is full of lies. Everyone is involved in trying to make the best they can by fair means or foul. Everyone, of course, by implication, except him. Now, it turns out that to some extent he is able to see the fact that his personality also contains flaws. But he doesn't entirely understand his flaws, and particularly he doesn't understand the egoism involved in setting himself up as the judge of society, as the condemning lawgiver. He wants to usurp the place of God and have God's perfect moral judgment. And the aspiration that one achieve perfect moral virtue and that one be able to completely seal oneself off from the evils of the world is impossible. It's impractical. And the impracticality of this stance is one of the things that's criticized in this play. To see that we have to have a certain prudent recognition that by being part of society, by being the social animals that we are, we can't avoid, to some extent, the taint of the human condition. Some sins come along just by the fact that we are human beings that must live in society. We must occasionally tell people that we think their ties are good-looking, even if we don't think so. Right? Sometimes it's prudent, and it's not such an evil thing to tell a lie about something like that. Now, the next thing that happens is that a minor character, Orant, comes in, and he's a poet, or actually a would-be poet, a dreadful poet. And all the great poets, and in this case Moliere, have a very good time in lampooning bad poets. It's one of the things that every poet enjoys doing if he's good. And this minor character reads a poem to Alceste and Philinte and says to them, "What do you think of my poem?" Which is something analogous to the question of, "What do you think of my tie?" And the prudent and sensible and yet still virtuous Philinte says, "I think that was just a wonderful poem. You have a real poetic gift, and if I were you, I would go back home and write a great many more sonnets because it seems to me that you're a great contribution to our national literature. I can't imagine a better poem than that." And of course, all through this, listening to this wretched doggerel, the misanthrope Alceste is standing there thinking, "I can't believe it. First of all, this poem is dreadful. It's a horrible piece of work. I can't believe that an idiot like this would expose himself to the ridicule that's involved in being a bad poet." Second of all, what outrages the misanthrope even more is the fact that his friend, who is otherwise often a moral man, often a good man, is willing to submit to the lies and hypocrisy characteristic of society. He's going to praise a bad author when he really doesn't deserve praise. Well, unfortunately, our would-be poet asks the misanthrope for his honest opinion. Now, when people ask you for an honest opinion about their poetry or about their artistic capacities, as a rule, the last thing they want is an honest opinion about their artistic capacities. What they want is praise. And Alceste does not suffer fools gladly, and he does not praise things that he thinks are dreadful. And in so many words, in a very caustic and cutting way, he says, "You have absolutely no poetic talent, and I wish you wouldn't make such an ass of yourself. Put the poem away. As a matter of fact, it's not even a poem. Throw it away. Don't tell me any more about your poetry, and I think you might take something else up. It's possible to be a good man and not be a poet. For example, you potentially could be a good man, and I'm sure you're not a poet." Well, our would-be poet is angered by this because he didn't come for real criticism. He didn't really want an accurate assessment of his poetic gifts. And he institutes a lawsuit for slander, which shows just how corrupt society is. Yes, indeed, even bad poets can sue, and especially if they're aristocratic figures, influential figures in society, they potentially can make these suits for slander stick. Now, the next thing that happens after our would-be poet withdraws is that what we get is a movement or a scene between the misanthrope and Célimène, who is this coquette, this flirt, this hypocritical, dishonest, yet beautiful young woman that has captivated our misanthrope. And what happens here is very intriguing. He castigates her for being cruel. He says, "You're dishonest, you're not kind to me, you show no appreciation for the fact that I'm in love with you, and in fact, you have altogether too many suitors. As a matter of fact, you're on kind of an ego trip. You like all these men knocking at your door, telling you how beautiful and how wonderful you are. The fact of the matter is that my virtuous moral love is superior to all of them, and what I want you to do, get rid of them. And she, of course, says, oh, my, I really don't have other suitors. And besides, these friends that I have come in, I enjoy society unlike you, and I like people unlike you, and I really rather enjoy mixing with them. So please, don't expect me to do that. I'm faithful to you, and of course I love you, which is what she tells everyone. And she represents the kind of hypocrisy that Alceste, the misanthrope, justifiably hates. And at the same time, there's a strange mixture of love and hate here. What an odd object for his affections. So we have a scene in which we see how cruel she can be and how difficult it is to manage one's emotions, even though the misanthrope Alceste would like to believe that he really does. Now, move a little further. After Alceste and reproaches Célimène, he decides he's going to withdraw, and then he changes his mind. Says, no, in a way, just to spite you, I'm going to stay. And this illustrates another aspect of our misanthrope's personality. He's very contrary. He likes to contradict people. He sort of gets off on telling them how bad they are. I think it was Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust who says, I am the spirit which negates. Well, there is a little bit of that Mephistophelian deviltry in the misanthrope, and he doesn't recognize that in himself. He likes telling people how bad they are, and he likes being kind of contrary. So he decides to stay, and she has two courtiers come in, and these people are men of fashion. They're fops. One of them is a suitor of Célimène, but of course that's not made obvious immediately, and they engage in the most vicious backbiting gossip. It's really juicy and a wonderful little passage. As a matter of fact, it's quite an extended passage. She says some very, very unkind things about the other women at court, and of course, doubtless she's very kind and polite to them to their face, and they exchange juicy tidbits, and it has all the qualities, all the posturing, hypocrisy, and evil that the misanthrope hates. And yet, oddly, for whatever emotional reasons, there he is, not participating in it, but sitting there fuming and disapproving, as he always does. Into this group, after the others leave, into this group, we see that Alceste is in fact, comes a messenger who says that Alceste actually has been sued for slander by our would-be poet. So, in fact, he knows that he's going to get into big trouble. And, of course, that just shows him even more how corrupt society is. He's actually going to sue me for slander when, in fact, I told the truth, I told my real opinion, and, in fact, I was right. He has no poetic talent. Ask my friend who praised him. If you ask Philante, does this guy really have any poetic talent? He says, of course he doesn't have any poetic talent. But if somebody doesn't have poetic talent, you don't say that. And he says, well, if you don't say that, it just shows how corrupt and dishonest you are. It's not exactly that the misanthrope is wrong, it's that he has no sense of proportion. He doesn't exercise the appropriate tact and judgment. So he's going to be sued for slander, and he says, I will state my case on the fact that I am innocent and that I have said the right thing. I will not dispute this case. If a corrupt society wants to run amok against me, well, just let it. That'll just prove just how corrupt society is, and in a way, it'll vindicate me and show that if a corrupt society can't deal with my truthfulness and honesty, it just shows how superior I am to all that. He is implicitly on a sort of ego trip here. Now, they withdraw. We move into another scene. And here we see a minor character, Arsinoe, brought in. Now, Arsinoe can be thought of as the female alter ego of Alceste, the misanthrope. She is kind of cruel, kind of devious, but also likes that posture, stern, moral rigor. And the real reason is that she's gotten a little old. She's no longer the belle of the ball. And because men are no longer attracted to her, she's decided that it's time to be extremely virginal and extremely good. And it's time to set herself up as the judge of the mores of society. In fact, what she is a frustrated wannabe. If she had the choice, she would actually be a coquette like Célimène, but she can't. So as a cover for that, in order not to admit that she can't be the belle of the ball, she's decided to adopt this position of extreme, inflexible righteousness. She's the female analog of Alceste in the same way that Eliante is who's a kind of sympathetic but moral female figure, is the kind of alter ego, the female analog of Philante. Well, Arsinoe comes and talks to her friend Célimène, and they gossip viciously, but of course you'd never guess that because they're so polite. They gossip about each other. and they criticize each other, but only in the most indirect and underhanded ways. Arsinoe comes and says, "My dear, sit down. We must have a little chat. Not I, and certainly I would never approve of such a thing, but I've heard in certain circles that you have been criticized, and I've certainly protested that you are very virtuous, but I'm afraid that that word does get around. Some people have suggested that you have more than one suitor, and some people have suggested that you're hypocritical and devious and lying, and of course I told people that they were wrong. But appearance is often mistaken for reality, my dear, and it might be more proper if you were less loose in your behavior, if you didn't admit as many strange men into your quarters, if you didn't lie to all of them and say that they were the only suitor, because word is starting to get out about you, and the fact of the matter is that reputation is very valuable. Now, what of course this means is, you hussy, how could you dare do something like that? She is jealous. This alleged benefit is in fact a stalking horse for her jealousy. This criticism isn't something she's heard, it's something she's made up. But because she doesn't have the nerve to actually say what she thinks, what she's doing is saying, I defended you, of course, but there are certain ill-disposed people who have suspected that you're a bad, bad woman. It's really a kind of mask for her own jealousy. In other words, she is the height of sanctimonious hypocrisy. She has no sense of proportion, and she is, in that respect, a malevolent figure in this play. Now, after she says that, Salome, not to be outdone, because she's a vicious little piece of work as well, she says, well, incidentally, Arsinoe, I've heard some gossip about you, and please don't get me wrong, but there are those who think that you're posturing about morality and the old-time virtues and about good womanhood and how women ought to really act. Many of them, they think that that's because you've become old and wrinkled and now you're ugly. And because the men who like me don't like you, and because you're jealous of me, some ill-disposed people, not me of course, but some other people that I've talked to, have suggested that you're a sanctimonious hypocrite. And many of them have said that you'd better keep your nose out of other people's business and attract such men as you can. And if you want to pursue virtue, that's a very fine thing, but please don't use it as a stalking horse, as a mask for your own jealousy, for your own perverse evil. And, of course, these women who are just having at each other in the most vicious and yet cultivated way. I mean, I think that this particular scene is one of the high points of French letters because it's so delicate. It's like wrapping your sledgehammer up in velvet. It's just lovely. It's one of the high points in French comedy. Well, they have back and forth at each other, and it's really vicious. There's quite a bit of emotional bloodletting in only the most polite way. Well, they criticize each other, and then Salome withdraws to write some letters. And our friend, the misanthrope, comes in, and it turns out that our honest and sincere Arsinoe really has a thing for the misanthrope, is very much attracted to him. But of course, being the careful and moral lady that she is, could never admit such a thing. She doesn't have sins of the flesh, doesn't have that sort of desire. And yet she shamelessly flatters Alceste, saying, I've heard at court that people think very highly of you and respect you enormously. No one really understands your true merit. And, of course, not to be outdone, Alceste says, Madam, although people may not understand my true merit, in fact, people are praised promiscuously nowadays. I don't care whether they praise me or not. Who cares? What good is the praise of someone who praises everyone indiscriminately? What advantage would that be to me? She's shamelessly flattering him. She made this up. And it doesn't work because he's not interested in that sort of flattery. He doesn't care what other people think. The more they like him, the more he suspects their motives, the more he suspects them of hypocrisy. So they're sort of alter egos, and she has a real thing for him, but can't attract him because this kind of pseudo-virtue is most unattractive. This hypocrisy is evident to anyone that can pierce the veil of her pretense. So she she flatters him, and it doesn't work, and then she says, as a kind of vicious way of getting back at Salome, you know, your Salome is not true to you, she is false. And, of course, Alceste, in some respects, is more than willing to believe this about everyone. Everyone's false. Everyone's hypocritical. So it almost goes without saying that his lady love, the woman he really wants in life, is going to be lying to him and hypocritical. But on the other hand, he'd prefer not to believe it because he really does love her. And he really wants her, which is a kind of odd irony here. And he says, I prefer not to believe that, but in some respects I suspect it to be so. And she says, I can prove it. I will send you a letter of hers that fell into my hands, which is a love letter to someone else. She didn't write this to you. I will send it to you, and then you will have proof that she's unfaithful to you. She's untrue. Well, he eventually gets the letter and reads it, and he's horrified. Yet, his worst assumptions about human nature are confirmed here. He actually finds out about this letter, and he's just angered and infuriated. And not only is he betrayed by his ladylove, by Célimène, he also refuses to retract anything he said about this earlier poet. In other words, he's given a chance to avoid this terrible lawsuit, which is going to ruin him financially. And he says, I will not retract one word. Everything I said was true. I stand on the rock of truth. If society cannot deal with that, then society is such that I want no intercourse with it. I will not retract anything. And there's a small scene in which Philinte and Eliante comment on the fact that he won't retract this. And Eliante says, in many respects, I find the misanthrope Alceste admirable. He's a wonderful, honest, virtuous man. He has his faults, and he can be a little bit bearish, but you can't help but admire somebody that is really sincere. He says things that he believes, whether it's politic to do so or not. You can't help but admire that. And it's at this point that Philinte says to Eliante, well, I admire him too. I see his virtues and his vices. I think highly of him. But to be honest, although I understand that you have a certain love for him, I'm in love with you as well. And although I may only be second best, if it were ever possible, I would certainly like to have your hand in marriage. Well, we come back now to Alceste, who comes to Célimène with this letter and confronts her and says, Madam, you have been false to me. How can you be so duplicitous, you evil thing? Look at this letter and account for every syllable. You speak of love and of kindness and of beauty in someone else who's not me, and you told me that you were truthful to me. Now fess up. Let's get down to it. Well, she ignores him insofar as that's possible, and then she lies outright. And Alceste doesn't want to believe the lie, but he is in some respects a prisoner of his own emotions, right? He is a slave of love. And without entirely believing it, he doesn't know quite what to do, so at least provisionally he accepts her explanation. The letter apparently was written to a woman. And the implication here is not lesbianism. The implication is that she just has a very close woman friend, and that's her bosom buddy, and that she's written a lovely complimentary letter to. Now, it's a very implausible explanation, but it's a gauge of the depth of Alceste's love and blindness towards Célimène, that he is willing to accept this really lame explanation as at least provisionally true. At the same time, we are informed that Alceste has lost his lawsuit, and in fact, the would-be poet, the pseudo-poet who sued him for slander, has won a tremendous judgment against him. In some respects, of course, this ruins him financially, ruins him practically. On the other hand, it vindicates him in a way, because it shows just how evil and corrupt society is. A good man who justifies his actions simply on the basis of truth is convicted of slander. Doesn't that show how evil and hypocritical society is? Who would want to be part of such a society? He will go and leave society altogether. It does not deserve a virtuous figure like him. Well, another one of Célimène's beaux shows up at the same time that Alceste is there, after she had just made this really lame excuse about the love letter, and says, Madam, I know that you have, and this is the minor character, says, Madam, I know, and this minor character is in fact the same poet, incidentally, who has just sued the misanthrope. They both come in, and the poet says, Madam, I insist that you choose between us two suitors. I know that you have a whole string of men who desire you, but I will not play second fiddle to anyone. Choose. And Alceste the misanthrope chimes in, yes, absolutely, choose. You must choose. We will have an answer here. And at this point, while they're demanding that she choose, two other figures, the same ones who had been engaged in the earlier gossip, show up, and one of them is a suitor of Célimène, and they come up with letters that prove that she has been duplicitous. And one of the beautiful exposures of hypocrisy in society here is when they read Célimène's evaluation of each of the suitors. Oh, it's harsh. She says, Orant, the poet, who has just won this slander suit, is no poet at all. In fact, he's an idiot and a tedious bore. And, of course, he withdraws. And the other suitor gets his comeuppance. And, of course, at the end, there's a little paragraph explaining how she really feels about our friend the misanthrope. And she says, he is entertaining once in a while because he's so bearish and so impossible. But what a tedious, sanctimonious yokel he is. I don't see how anyone can stand him. Well, the truth will out. Everyone withdraws, except in this case, the misanthrope. There they are. And the two courtiers are gone, and Alceste, the misanthrope, says, Madam, I would be willing to marry you anyway. Perhaps this is just his way of wearing the hair shirt. Perhaps he wants to improve his lady love. Perhaps he's just the slave of passion. It's hard to say. Perhaps all three of those things operate. But what he says is, I will marry you anyway, but only on the condition that you join me in retreat from society. Let us go become hermits together. I will have nothing to do with a society that is as corrupt as all this. Look how it's corrupted you. Look how it's corrupted poetry. Look how the Times and the mores are corrupt. Let's leave society altogether. And she says, look, I would be willing to marry you, which is kind of a strange turn of events in any case, but I'd be willing to marry you. But I'm 20 years old, and I enjoy society. And yes, it's hypocritical, but so what? Society is a good thing, and human beings are social animals. And no, I will not marry you if the price of marriage is total withdrawal from society. I am not a misanthrope like you. Well, it turns out that our misanthrope then will not marry her. His second choice might have been Eliante, but he says in that scene, because Eliante and Philante are there to witness this conclusion, he says to Eliante, Madam, you would be a very fine and virtuous choice. I have the greatest respect for you, but I do not wish to marry. I myself am too virtuous to deal with a corrupt society like this. I am going to withdraw and become a hermit, become an anchorite. I will have nothing to do with society. I ask your forgiveness, madam. And he does kind of bow out. At this point, Philante says to Eliante, look, I've always loved you. I told you before I loved you. I know that I'm the second choice, but please marry me. I really do wish to marry you. Will you accept me as your husband? And she says yes. And then the concluding line is, as the couple leave, as Philante and Eliante make their exit, they say, let us go to Alceste. Let us help this unhappy man. And at that point, the play ends. In the finish for the misanthrope, for Alceste, is not especially happy, but there is a happy ending for Philante and Eliante, the people who are moral, yet who understand tact, and who have a sense of proportion, and who know that there's an inevitable degree of corruption that comes in with society, but that white lies are not the same thing as absolute moral evil. These people, the ones who recognize the immorality in society, who do what they can to avoid it, they're not like Célimène, those are the people who are really able to marry, and those are the ones that have a happy ending. Now, that's a fascinating play, and the best part about it, to be honest, is the verse. If any of you read French, I would strongly recommend that you read it in the original because it's beautiful and delicate and light. It doesn't, Moliere doesn't translate very easily. If you're going to read it in English, try the translation of Richard Wilbur because it takes a poet like that to do a satisfactory job of transferring the verse. But here I want to step back a little bit from this play now and look at the symbolism here. We might say, and this is just the broadest kind of generalization, but I think it has a great deal of truth overall, that tragedies end in death and comedies end in marriage. Not always, but generally speaking they do. Not in every case. You can think of, say, Oedipus, who doesn't die, he just gets blinded, and you can think of comedies that don't end in marriage, for example, Don Quixote. But on the whole, you'll find that comedies end in marriage, tragedies end in death. May I suggest that what this symbolizes is that when the tragic hero dies, he's being individuated and pulled away from society. He is meeting his own specific and personal fate. Whereas the comic hero is married. And what that symbolizes is the reintegration into society after some mistake or misfortune, which is the substance of the comedy. So the reason why the comic hero, as a rule, marries at the end of a comedy is because what comedy symbolizes is the reintegration of the hero into society. Now, let's take this a little bit further and make a further subdivision in comedy, or at least in the morally didactic comedies. In my lecture on Erasmus, I talked about two traditions coming out of Roman satire that attempt to improve society and improve the spectator by making moral points, by teaching them a moral lesson. And I said there were two kinds, the kind of harsh, grating, impaling, angry satire, characteristic of Juvenal in the ancient world, and perhaps characteristic of somebody like Jonathan Swift in the modern world, master of disgust. That sort of satire, that sort of comedy, attempts to improve the listener, improve the hearer, by showing them how evil and odious almost everyone and almost everything is, how commonplace and banal evil is, how almost everything is corrupt. The advantage of this is that it is largely true. Right? There's a good bit of justice in this sort of conception of society, but the difficulty is that it doesn't fulfill the didactic purpose of comedy because it's so shrill and so angry that people tend to withdraw from it. It's a little bit repulsive, even though it's entertaining at the same time. So people tend to pull back from it. If you've ever read Jonathan Swift, he really is disgusted with the world, and people with some justice called him a misanthrope. The other tradition in comedy comes out of Horace and the kind of gentle, understanding, kind-hearted satire, which has the same didactic purpose. It tries to give a moral lesson to the spectator. The difference is that it doesn't thunder, it doesn't rage, it gently prods fun at the foibles and failings of human beings, but in an understanding way which doesn't repulse us quite so thoroughly. Now, the difference here is that the Horatian poet, or the Erasmian poet, or Moliere himself, are the kind of people who poke fun at society, but who also try and show that these are not irremediable evils, and that things aren't quite so bad as all that. It's understanding, and also it places the comic poet, who is also a social critic, places him more or less on our level. He doesn't stand above us like Jeremiah thundering down with the word of God. Instead, he understands the real facts of human life, that some evils are unavoidable, and while there is a certain degree of corruption in society, you have to take the good with the bad. You do the best you can with the human condition. The Greeks used to say, at least at the time of Homer, that anger was a pleasant emotion. And in the case of Juvenal and in the case of Swift, it may be that these people don't realize how much pleasure they're getting from castigating society very severely. Certainly it's the case of our misanthrope Alceste here, that he doesn't realize what an ego trip he's on. He doesn't realize how much fun he's having telling everybody what perverse, evil scum they are, because it's his way of justifying himself in a kind of backhanded, indirect way. What I'm trying to suggest here is something like this, that what Moliere is doing in this play, and why I think it's one of the greatest achievements of dramatic art in the history of the world, is that he's talking not just about these people and not just about these qualities in human nature. He's talking about the nature of comic literature altogether. Alceste represents the Juvenalian and Swiftian perspective on comedy, the adamant, eager comic who is criticizing society harshly and thoroughly is in fact a social critic who is getting off on telling everybody how bad they are. They don't understand their own egoism, and they don't understand the didactic function of comic literature. Because they're so harsh in their criticism, they don't actually improve people as much as they might. By being so harsh, no one takes them seriously, or fewer people take them seriously, and because they don't understand their own implicit egoism, they really don't understand that they are part of the problem that they're trying to castigate. Right? So they're trying to set the harsh comic, the harsh social critic, is one who places himself above society and says, you're all evil. And isn't that what our misanthrope does? Now, think about Philante. And also think about the resonances here. Any of you know the Greek word philia, which means love? And also is also the Greek word for adhesion. Well, notice that at the end of this play, Philante, which sounds a little bit like love, manages to marry Eliante, who's also a moral yet understanding and compassionate person. May I suggest that Philante is the true hero of this play and not the misanthrope? In other words, Alceste is not the hero of the play that's named after him. The real hero is Philante. Why? Because he's the one that actually is able to get married. He's the one that's able to be reintegrated back into society. And the reason why is that he understands that he's not so much superior to everyone else. Yes, corruption is real in society, but you have to be willing to give it a certain degree of latitude and a certain degree of play. Because he's not so self-righteous, he's the true comic hero. And this comic hero represents that whole tradition of comedy that at least goes from Horace on up through Erasmus and right into Moliere himself. In other words, Moliere is representing an entire tradition of comedy, the tradition of comedy of which he is a part, as being the true specimen of the comic hero. In other words, the comedian is the comic hero here. A whole tradition, or two contrasting traditions in comedy are being compared implicitly. This is, in other words, not just a work of literature, it's a work of literary criticism. And it's a work of literary criticism which, oddly enough, vindicates itself. How reflexive and how lovely and beautiful to do it with such elegance and grace. And now let's think about that last line. Philont and Eliant have decided to get married. And what do they say? Now that the misanthrope, who is the kind of harsh critic, is unable to marry, unable to become a comic hero, unable to reintegrate into society, they say at the end of the play, let us go and help this unfortunate man. Let us go and help this unhappy man. What does that mean? The whole play, The Misanthrope, is an attempt, in a kind of giant collective sense, to go and help this unhappy man. This unhappy man is that whole tradition of harsh, unforgiving criticism. What he is saying is, this play, if it is read by the would-be comic poet, tells him the right way to write comic poetry. You write it from a perspective of understanding and kindness and compassion, which does not set you up as the judge of all of mankind. Or if you do judge it kindly, because you share the same vices. We are social animals. An amazing intellectual achievement, given the fact that it is beautifully constructed, that the symbolism works extraordinarily well, there's not a word out of place here, and it's given to us in very affecting, very moving, very profound verse. We might say then that this is a statement about the philosophy of comedy as well as a particular comedy itself. Not only is comedy, as Moliere said, the school of men, not only does it serve a didactic function, it can serve a function towards creating new and greater comedies which continue to serve the same purpose. It is a way, in a way, I would say that Moliere's Misanthrope is the meta-comedy. At least I believe that is the way Moliere intended it. It is a comedy about comedy. It is a comedy which shows, by holding up to ridicule the misanthropic qualities of Juvenalian comedy, of Swiftian comedy, and it does so in a gentle, kind-hearted way, which he hopes will have the didactic effect of improving future poets by allowing them to understand how they ought to write comedy. What a great achievement and what a great work of art. I hope that I've redeemed my claim that Moliere's Misanthrope is one of the great achievements of the human spirit and the human soul, and with the possible exception of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, I think it shows that comedy is very serious stuff as well as being very entertaining stuff. I hope it shows that comedy can edify and entertain, and it offers us the possibility of truly moral art, which would make the most rigorous moral critic and the most rigorous aesthetic connoisseur happy at the same time. It is the high point of what we might call Platonic or Tolstoyan art. It is art which improves and entertains and edifies at the same time. It is well worth your reading. And if there's, of all the lectures that I gave and of all the things that I've talked about in the course of this series, of all the books that I think are really worthwhile, I would urge you to go home and read this book when you get the chance. There is no one who will not benefit from this. And no matter how sophisticated your tastes and no matter how jaded your experience with the world, this refreshes and improves all who have contact with it.